So today we will be talking about Julio Cortázar's work. Cortázar was one of the main writers in what is known today as the Latin American boom movement, which is a movement that took place in the 60s and 70s in literary studies, where for the first time Latin American writers entered the center stage of literature. Cortázar was one of the main writers in this group, and he was well known, and he's still valued, I think, as a writer quite a lot for his experimental work, especially when it came to narrative structure. However, today we will be looking at his work in general, and this will include some short stories. In fact, today I asked you to read House Taken Over, which in his short stories, Cortázar explores a different style of writing, and this is the one that we will be focusing mostly on today. But we will still have a mention or two of his most famous work, the novel Hopscotch, which is indeed very experimental, but we will try to keep it light. So specifically, we'll look at Cortázar's life and the context in which he came up, including the influence of Peronism, a political movement in Argentina. We will be looking at Cortázar's style, usually labeled as neo-romanticism, and his styleless use of language. We will get into this later. And we will be doing a close reading of his short story, House Taken Over. Okay, so here we have a summary of Cortázar's work. So Cortázar was born in 1914, soon after the First World War broke out, and he passed away in 1984. He is considered a neo-romantic writer, as I said before, who's well known for his novel Hopscotch, Rayuela, published in 1963. He's also the author of other 5 novels, most of them pictured here, and 10 collections of short stories, including Bestiary, which we will be looking at today, published in 1951. Some of his most famous short stories include House Taken Over, which you have read, as well as Las Babas del Diablo, which has been translated as Blow Up. He also wrote a short play during his lifetime titled Los Reyes, published in 1949, but it did not do very well. So Cortázar is mostly known for his short stories and especially for his novel Hopscotch. Even though Cortázar was born in Brussels, in Belgium, and he passed away in Paris, he considered himself to be an Argentinian writer. This is where he grew up. So Argentina, I imagine you're familiar with it, but it's a country located in South America. And here we have a map of it where Buenos Aires is highlighted. This is where Cortázar grew up. So both of his parents were Argentinian, and at the time of his birth, his father worked as an economist for the Argentine embassy in Brussels. In 1914, with the start of the war, Belgium was occupied by the Germans, so the Cortázar family moved to Switzerland and then to Spain before they moved back to Argentina. And at this time, Julio was about 4 and he only spoke French, so he learned Spanish while he was a little boy. His father left the family soon after their arrival, and Cortázar grew up with his sister Ofelia, and they were both raised by their mother. They grew up in Buenos Aires. They struggled a lot financially, which was common as it was a complicated period around the world, and Buenos Aires is mostly a middle-class province, so it's understandable. Throughout his life, Cortázar gave a lot of interviews, and he spoke a lot about his childhood. So because his childhood was very important to him and to how he viewed himself as a writer, I would like to talk about his early years a bit. As you can see, some themes from his life that he has mentioned in interviews do come up in his stories later on. So it's interesting to explore this aspect of his life. Cortázar has recalled being a very sensitive child and feeling very different from his peers. According to him, this was partly due to his appearance, because he was a very tall and slim boy, and because of his interest in reading, which made him a bit of a recluse. In an interview with a literary critic, Evelyn Picon Garfield, he has credited his mother with fostering his love for literature and reading from a very young age. Here he is pictured with his mother, Maria Herminia Descott, or Descott, because I suppose her surname is French. And this is what Cortázar said about her for the magazine Plural in 1975. My mother was very imaginative and had a specific vision of the world. She was not, quote unquote, cultured, but she was an incurable romantic, and she introduced me to travel novels. I read Jules Verne with her, and it was odd because women do not usually read Jules Verne. My mother read bad literature, was not cultured, but her imagination opened other doors for me. We had a game. We would look at the sky, search for shapes in the clouds, and make up grand stories. My friends were not so lucky. They did not have mothers who looked at clouds with them. In my home, we had a library and a culture of reading. So I think when Cortázar mentions that his mother was not necessarily cultured and that she liked bad literature, what he means to say is that she read popular literature, while Cortázar, as you will see, was more interested in philosophy and kind of highbrow literature. So he loved his mother very much and wrote her a lot of letters throughout his lifetime. If you're interested in reading them, a lot of them are available online. His reading habits were very precocious. His family said that he read all of Montaigne's essays at the age of 12. One of the writers who impressed him the most was Edgar Allan Poe, whose complete stories he would eventually translate into Spanish once he was an established writer. So Cortázar grew up being very close to his mother and his sister. He suffered from some minor health issues, including asthma. And since his mother was a bit hypochondriac when it came to the son, and he was a natural recluse who enjoyed spending most of his time indoors reading in his room. As a consequence of this, Cortázar seems to have had a strange relationship with intimacy, with the role of family and the home in general. So in a lot of his short stories, we can notice the presence of disease and the fear of disease. This comes up in the form of parasites, monsters, ghosts, and these erupt in intimate and supposedly safe spaces, usually homes, houses, apartments, such is the case with House Taken Over, as you have read, where the domestic rituals is disturbed by this unnamed presence that is taking over the house. In case you're interested in seeing, on the left, we see the house where Cortázar was living when he wrote the novel, and this is supposedly the house that inspired the story. It is not, I think, the kind of old, large house that he describes, but it's interesting to see. So he took some creative licenses. Another example, besides House Taken Over, would be his short story Circe, also present in Bestiary. That short story is centered on the life of a woman who attracts men into her apartment to feed them chocolates, but the chocolates are secretly filled with bugs. And this woman, she's kind of a temptress and takes some kind of pleasure in torturing the men covertly. But so again, we can see the presence of something that is usually very disturbing, such as ghosts or bugs in very intimate places. Cortázar started writing at a very young age, but he was very reluctant to publish. He only began to publish actively in his 30s. After school, he decided to become a teacher. And so while he was studying to be a teacher, he published his first works under the pseudonym Julio Denis. His collection of poetry, Presencia, was published in 1938, and it was closely followed by a short play called Los Reyes, which dealt heavily with Greek mythology. Neither of these publications did very well, neither with critics or with the readership in general. So they both went under the radar. When he finished his studies, Cortázar moved to Mendoza to teach at the newly opened University of Cuyo, UNC. So I'm going to go back to the map. Buenos Aires is highlighted over there, and Mendoza was right there. It's here. So it's quite close. He moved there to teach at the university, and this is where his life became intertwined with a political development in Argentina, which was the rise of Peronism, which allegedly has inspired some of the short stories in Bestiary, including House Taken Over, and we will get into that later. But the gist of it is that while he was teaching at the university, his colleagues were critical of him because he didn't voice his support of the Peronist party. Apparently, most of the teachers who worked at the university in Cuyo were Peronists, and because Cortázar did not manifest any support for the party, he was labeled a conservative. This became apparently a very uncomfortable environment for him, to the point where he eventually quit his job as a teacher. But before we continue with our story of Cortázar's life, let's talk a little bit about Peronism. Have you heard of Juan Domingo Perón or Evita Perón, perhaps of the musical Evita? or Peronism? Yeah, I see most of you are nodding. If you don't mind me asking, if any of you want to, share with the rest of us, what do you know about Peronism? Like, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Definitely. Perón was a military leader before he became a politician, and that's how he's pictured here. Indeed, his party clashed with the Argentinian military a couple of times, so that as well. Anyone else? Absolutely. His party was concerned with social reform. He was the first socialist president in Argentina, so that is right on the money. That is still up for debate, but I think some people consider him, yes, a populist leader. Yes, indeed. Evita Perón was very revered by a lot of people in Argentina, and the party was insanely popular. It was the most popular party that Argentina had seen up until that point. So, okay, you're all familiar with Peronism. This was a political movement spearheaded by Juan Domingo Perón, a military leader who eventually rose to prominence in the early modern Argentina's political landscape. In what context did Peronism come up? Before Peronism, Argentina was ruled by the Partido Autonomista Nacional, also known as PAN. This was an economically liberal but politically elitist party. The party was followed by the Radical Party, Partido Radical, which mostly represented intellectuals and Creoles. Creoles is the word used to refer to white Argentinians who come from Spanish or other European backgrounds. So Perón was the first politician to rise to power on a platform of social reform and the plan to integrate Argentina's working class, both urban and rural, into politics. He achieved milestones for the working class, such as home ownership, the right to fair pay, rest, vacations. So his impact on Argentinian politics was huge. It was a party that was very controversial at the time and has remained very controversial ever since, despite the great wins that the party achieved for working class Argentinians. To understand just how revolutionary and controversial it was, bear in mind that Perón's mandate came to an end by means of a military coup twice. So Perón was thrown out of government twice. On the one hand, his economic policy created some big issues after some initial successes. The policy of the party was very heavy on spending, which makes sense. This is how they redistributed a lot of wealth in Argentina, but it depended too strongly on Argentina's role as a global provider of foodstuffs. So during the Second World War, Argentina sold grains and meat to Europe and the US, but after the Western economies recovered, the situation changed and Argentina's economy was left in a very vulnerable position. So this gave way to unrest among Argentinians. And on the other hand, Perón's socialist platform was very threatening to the traditional Creole elites, especially the ones in Buenos Aires. Because the party was proposing a kind of political and social integration that had not been seen in the country before. So a quick story of Peronism would be Perón was elected in 1946 after a short military career. He governed for 2 terms until a coup was organized against him. He was taken out of power, the party was banned, and Perón was forced to go into exile. A military dictatorship followed, and then the party was allowed to be re-elected in 1973. But very tragically, Perón passed away the following year in 1974. And I say this is tragic because he had to be replaced by his vice president, who was his second wife, Isabel, who had not been trained as a politician, so she did not last very long in power. So another dictatorship took place, and this happened in 1976. This was the beginning of the most violent and most tragic military dictatorship in Argentinian history. In case you're not perhaps familiar with the Latin American region, in Latin America, military dictatorships, especially during the 19th and 20th century, were quite common. Argentina and Brazil are 2 examples of countries that suffered through a lot of them. But the dictatorship that started in 76 has become well known around the world because of the role of the disappeared. So a lot of people revolutionaries, but also common people in Argentina, disappeared from their homes and were taken into these clandestine detention centers. And a lot of activism began to take place because of that. So perhaps you've heard of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo. They have become very famous. But so this is a context in which Cortázar was an adult and the context in which he became a successful writer. So because of this, he would eventually leave Argentina, like a lot of artists did at the time. But let's go back to his life. So after he renounced from the university at Cuyo because he had some clashes with his colleagues, he moved back to Buenos Aires, and he worked as a manager in a publishers association, while also writing literature and working as a certified translator in his free time. This is the time where Cortázar began to rise to fame. Bestiary was published, and that collection of short stories attracted critical acclaim and a wide readership. While it should have been a very good time in his life, Cortázar has described it as dangerously stressful. He felt a lot of pressure to write, and it's manifested as a series of episodes of neurosis and recurrent nightmares, many of which have inspired the short stories in Bestiary. So soon after the publication of the book, Cortázar decided to move to Paris, partly to find some solace during this very stressful time in his life, but also because Argentina was going through a complicated time. So he decided to move to France. He resided in Paris for the rest of his life, and this city became a very significant influence on his work and his personal life, shaping many of his writings, including Hopscotch. So Cortázar is renowned for his innovative narrative techniques, which are mostly exemplified in this novel, which is his most famous work. So Hopscotch, I will very shortly recall the story of the novel in case you're not familiar with it, because then the explanation of the novel, which will make more sense. So the story is centered around an Argentinian man called Horacio Oliveira, who, like Cortázar, decides to move to Paris due to dissatisfaction with his life back home. Oliveira navigates romantic relationships, as well as infatuation, artistic aspirations, and existential struggles in the city of Paris. But what is special about the novel? Hopscotch experiments with a non-linear narrative. This means that the novel does not follow a chronological order. Many novels bypass linear storytelling by using foreshadowing, ellipses, dreams, flashbacks. These are the literary devices that most of us are familiar with. But the novel goes further than that. Cortázar created a novel where readers can choose their own path throughout the story. So the novel includes a manual of instructions at the beginning, written by Cortázar himself, that details 2 possible readings. This is a very experimental move, as Cortázar in the manual is addressing his reader directly. So in a way, breaking the fourth wall. The novel consists of 155 chapters, which Cortázar divided into a main narrative, which can be read chronologically from chapters 1 to 56. And the rest he refers to in the manual as the expandable chapters, which can be incorporated in any order. But most of all, Cortázar wants to encourage his readers to tackle the chapters in any order that they see fit. And read in any order, the novel holds up. This is its most remarkable aspect. The chapters can be read in multiple sequences, combined like building blocks, achieving a very singular kind of fluidity. So as we explore Oliveira's struggles in the city, and through his exploration of Paris, we as readers get to travel back and forth in his life. In other words, we rearrange the threads that tie Oliveira's life together, and as we experiment with our reading, we weave his life in different ways. Perhaps Cortázar is proposing to us that life has a non-linear intensity, a quality that can only be represented with a non-linear narrative. So in his novel, he captures life in a new, innovative way. Okay, so we can jump to the next section of the lesson, which is concerned with Cortázar's style. So now that you know the key moments of his life and the context in which he was writing, we can really get into his style. So, have any of you heard of Romanticism before, either in literature or art or just philosophy, culture in general, and what words do you associate with it? Does anything come to mind? Absolutely right. So English Romanticism in literature was very important, and indeed, as beautiful and kind of harmless as Romanticism seems to us nowadays, at the time it was a bit of a countercultural movement, so it was quite revolutionary. Here we have some works of art from famous Romantic painters, which I thought bring to us some of the key themes in Romanticism. As you can see, for example, we have a lot of natural elements, flowers, a volcano that is erupting, butterflies and owls. Natural elements feature very often in Romanticism. As you can see in the engraving, it's not a painting, the engraving on the right by Francisco Goya, this is called El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. So when reason is asleep, monsters appear. And Romanticism was indeed very concerned with knowledge production, human knowledge production, outside of the traditional outside of the traditional methodology of logic, philosophy, math, and it was more concerned with the occult, with superstitions, with art, and with romance. So indeed, some of you were already familiar with Romanticism, which was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in 18th century Europe and reached its peak in the early to mid 19th century. It emphasized emotion, imagination, individualism, and the beauty of nature. Romanticism worked as a counter movement to the period that we now refer to as the Enlightenment, which ranged from the 17th to the early 18th century. During the Enlightenment, indeed, like Paul said before, intellectuals were more focused on the power of human rationality to discover the world through science and philosophy, as opposed to imagination and personal experience. Have any of you heard of Edgar Allan Poe, perhaps? Yes? Yes. Oh, most of you are nodding. He's a classic example of a romantic writer. So Edgar Allan Poe, who, as we've mentioned, Cortázar adored as a young boy, is an excellent example of romantic literature. His works delve into the, I'm sorry, into the darker aspects of human psychology, exploring emotions such as fear, anxiety, and themes such as death and the macabre. They also contain many natural figures and elements, such as crows in his very famous poem, mountains, dirt, and storms. Poe's writing is characterized by some very rich descriptions and vivid imagery, and for his focus on the mysterious and the supernatural. Poe is an example also of how usually in literature, Romanticism is associated with grandiose and dramatic prose. And here is an example of that. So would any of you like to read these quotes? We have two very short quotes, one by Edgar Allan Poe from his famous poem, The Raven, published in 1845, and a short extract from House Taken Over. I think that last line really draws the point home. I think I said that. It's such a simple turn of phrase. But what do you think, or what differences do you all find between the style of writing in these two quotes? That is a very good point. Oh, I think you also want to say something? Absolutely. Oh, I think perhaps would you like to say something as well, or are you okay? That is very true. There is a more material character to Cortázar's writing. The language is more accessible in Cortázar's writing than it is in Poe. And this is precisely his style. I think you could agree that both of them are quite romantic, and they're both interested in the macabre and in superstitions. And yet their styles couldn't be any more different. Cortázar's style is less elaborate and grandiose than that of the older romantics, and this is his signature style. He tried to create what he called styleless texts in interviews, and these ironically became his own style. His linguistic simplicity and reluctance to cultivate a specific literary style is what set him apart from modernist writers who were very concerned with experimentation with language, and also from postmodern writers who were fans of complex literary techniques such as intertextuality or meta-literature. Intertextuality refers to a text that can reference other texts and genres inside of it, and meta-literature to a conscious address of the device of fiction. So Cortázar, indeed, his style was very accessible, and usually, and definitely this is the case for his short stories, his narrative style was as well. So in short, his style included the presence of romantic themes, linguistic simplicity, the absence of a cultivated style, and an absence of intertextuality, meta-literature, and other complicated devices. Perhaps, since you've already read House Taken Over, you have identified some romantic themes in the story. Does anything come to mind? For example, the presence of a supernatural event? That's a very good point. And in that, it is very different from historical dramas, for example, or from realism. He does not want his stories to seem like a direct reference to real life. Instead, he places us in this very undefined realm where anything can happen. Perhaps a theme that is very absent in this short story is the presence of nature. But the collection of short stories is indeed called Bestiary. So a lot of other stories in the collection do feature animal characters. For example, in Letter to a Lady in Paris, Carta a una señorita en París, which I think is the second most famous story from the collection. And it's the story about a man who has a deep, dark secret. And this is that under situations of stress, he throws up little bunnies. And this is, well, a complex insight into the character's psychology. It's Taken Over. It was published in 1951. I'll tell you a thing or two about it before we get into the quotes. So, as I said, it was published in the collection Bestiary, and it was critically acclaimed and widely read. Part of the attention that this story enjoyed was due to the fact that it was published by Jorge Luis Borges, who at the time was the biggest writer in Argentina. In 1946, Borges was the top editorial authority in the literary magazine Los Anales de Buenos Aires, the Annals of Buenos Aires. And when a friend brought him a copy of the short story, and according to Borges himself in interviews, he immediately sent it to print because he was convinced that it would be a hit. And indeed it was. The story was published in the magazine alongside this illustration, and perhaps you can use it to jog your memory. So would any of you like to perhaps briefly summarize what the story was about, who the main characters were, what they were like? Yes, main characters are the narrator, whose name we don't know, and his sister Irene, or Irene in English. Perhaps, do you remember where they live, how they got the house? Indeed. So they come from a family who seems to have a successful agricultural endeavor, which is very common in Buenos Aires. because Argentina is a country that is very focused on the production of, for example, a lot of different foodstuffs. So indeed, it is common for wealthy people who live in Buenos Aires to have their little ranches outside of Buenos Aires in the interior region of Argentina. And what else do you remember about the story? Yes, they mention their grandparents a lot, and I think it's interesting that you picked up on how the style of their lives is a bit antiquated. So what was the deal with the door? Why couldn't the brother and the sister live in the entirety of the house? Why did they have to shut a part of the house off? There's definitely a territorial dispute at place in the story between whatever it is that is taking over the house and the siblings who already live there. Indeed, perhaps by repeating the rituals of their ancestors, they keep, in a way, inviting them into the house. The disturbing quality of the story, I think, is how the siblings just give up and they abandon the house and they give up more and more rooms in the house to this strange, unnamed presence, which they don't even try to fight against. So it's a very fatalistic tale, I feel. So I think all of you recall the main story, so there's no need to go into that in detail, I think. So perhaps we'll just start out with a quote. So this is a quote from the beginning of the story, which I think introduces perhaps a disturbing quality, which is supposed to guide our reading a little bit. So I think perhaps in the beginning of the story, in this quote, we have a case of a foreshadowing. Is that something that you're familiar with? So a foreshadowing is a literary device by which the writer can anticipate something that will happen later on in the story just by hinting at it. And in this quote, he's hinting at the marriage of a brother and a sister, which, while being a description of, like many of you have said, a very passionless relationship or a passionless cohabitation, I think it's also introducing the idea that something in this cohabitation is very unnatural. That there is something here that is from the realm of the unaccepted, perhaps even the supernatural. At the same time, they refer to the house in a case of animism, so of an object kind of coming to life or gaining human qualities. They refer to the house as that which did not allow them to get married. And I think this is also introducing very early on the idea that these siblings are very passive in their resistance and they don't seem to be truly committed to carrying on the lives of kind of normal adults, but rather they seem to be very passive to the advances of this unnamed force that pushes them out of their house. Thank you. So how does this quote make you feel? And how does the idea of wool being knitted and unknitted and knitted again make you feel? Because to me, it gave me a sense of dread when I read it. And I think perhaps it felt the same way because she talked about how this routine was so sterile, how it was just going nowhere. Yes. clearly avoiding something. What is she avoiding with all of this knitting and unknitting? So the beginning of the quote is translated quite literally. The jacket is done and then undone, tejido y destejido. But then when Cortázar refers to the wool itself, in the English quote, he talks about a losing battle, while in the Spanish one, he talks about wool resisting to losing its shape. So there is an idea of resistance that is lost in the English translation, which I think hammers a little bit harder the idea that this is supposed to seem like a pursuit that is completely hopeless and that is not going anywhere. If we remember at the end of the story when the siblings leave the house, Irene Irene doesn't go back to get any of the things she has knitted, unlike her brother who does go back for some money. So perhaps when she leaves all of that knitting behind, when she leaves that pointless routine of knitting and unknitting, and she finally allows herself to lose her shape, to let go, it is when she finally breaks out of this very monotonous routine that is keeping her from living the life of a grown adult woman. So the knitting itself is a pretty interesting ritual that Irene has in the story. There is an interpretation indeed of Irene's knitting as being part of the theme of women knitting while they wait for their husbands, which goes back to Greek mythology. And in this line of reading, indeed, her knitting is interpreted as a way of negating her desire to find a partner and to find that husband. And so as she keeps knitting the same vest over and over, she keeps herself tied to this loveless and passionless marriage of sorts to her brother. Exactly. That is exactly what I was referring to. So thank you very much. That's it. Shortly after in the story, we see the presence of nightmares when Irene is talking in her sleep, and she talks, quote unquote, with a voice that came out of dreams, not from her throat. So it is a voice, a supernatural voice that comes from somewhere else. And this is an interesting inclusion in the story because Cortázar has mentioned, or he mentioned many times during his lifetime, that this story came to him in a dream. When he was living in the house that I showed you a photograph of before, he woke up in the middle of the night having dreamt not the story itself, but having had this feeling in dreams of being taken over, of being pushed out of his house by something he couldn't see. And this was the beginning of the story. And again, this nightmare took place during a period of Cortázar's life where he was having a lot of bad dreams. And that has influenced, I think, the short stories in Bestiary. Other than that, where do you think that this voice is coming from, if not from Irene's throat? Because it is the voice that awakens him when he then goes to grab a glass of water and he discovers that the presence has moved into the kitchen. That could certainly be the case, because whatever it is that is taking over their house is way beyond the physical realm. Like it seems to be absolutely everywhere. But yeah, that's an interesting reading. Perhaps he dreamt her voice. I will say a thing or two about how the story was translated, and then we can go into the possible political allegory that's taking place, discuss it, and then we wrap up. So in the story, well, these are two quotes from the story, one in English, one in Spanish. And I took this to highlight how the translator has decided to use the active tenses to narrate this story. So, for example, in this quote, I had to shut the door to the passage. They have taken over the back part. We have a person and we have a verb. They have taken. Meanwhile, in the Spanish version of the story, the original one, Cortázar uses a passive form to describe how this house is being taken over by a presence that cannot be named. And he achieves this through the use of the verb haber, which doesn't have a literal translation in English, but is somewhere between to have and to be. And haber can be conjugated in an impersonal conjugation. And so you can have a sentence like, han tomado la parte del fondo, which would more directly translate to the back part has been taken. So it is more similar to what is passive voice usually in English. And so I wonder, for the ones of you that read the story in English, do you think that this affected your reading in any way? Indeed, the use of they has been one of the aspects of the narration that some critics have used to argue for the presence of a political allegory in the story, which is also very relevant when it comes to the ending of the story. So as you remember, at the end, the narrator and his sister, they leave the house, they throw the key down the sewer, and they quickly go in and grab their money before they leave. And we have this final quote, which is the most famous from the story, which refers to some poor devils who would perhaps decide to go in and rob the house at that hour and with the house taken over. So in the middle of the night, the narrator and his sister seemed concerned about the existence of people who are anxious to get into their house, who can be found at any time in the middle of the night. And they have this anxiety regarding their material possessions, for example, their money, which can be difficult to understand considering that they came from a family that seemed to be well off. They could live without working. They had this very large and beautiful house, and yet they were very concerned that someone was going to take over it. And so this reading, together with the use of they, which seems to refer to people and not to this unnatural presence, has been used to propose that there is a political allegory at work. Are you familiar with allegories? It's a device in literature that is used through which characters, events, and settings in a narrative can represent concepts or ideas, and they often convey a deeper moral, philosophical, or political meaning. And there is a bit of a hint to this in the story in the name itself, which is house taken over. While in English, this might not mean much, in Argentina, casas tomadas, or houses taken over, are something very specific. Las casas y los terrenos tomados, the houses taken over, the lands taken over in Argentina, are those that have been taken by illegal dwellers or squatters who claim possession over a house or land and decide not to leave. Peronist governments, and more recently Kirchnerista governments, who are considered post-Peronists, these governments have allowed the technically illegal redistribution of private property for those who couldn't afford it. So for a lot of Argentinians, that the story was called, House Taken Over, was taken as a hint perhaps to Peronism. The specific image of the taken over house conveys a class anxiety about the loss of property, of status, and the destabilizing effect that redistributive policies and political inclusions can have on society. And this is also found, a curious detail is found in the rituals that the siblings have and what their house looks like in the story. I think some of you have mentioned that these rituals seem to be a bit antiquated. They do not seem to be modern people. They're not going to the movies, they're not taking public transport, they're not using their telephones. They seem to be kind of living in a different time, or at least an unspecified time. And so this has been also used, this detail has been used in favor of a political reading. So what do we know about the narrator and Irene? They come from a family of landowners who have a profitable farming development. They live in a large house with noisy wooden floors and a large, heavy oak door, which points to a style of architecture that would have been considered antiquated at the time of Cortázar's writing, which is the 1940s. The siblings spend their days knitting and cleaning. They do not go to work. They do not explore Buenos Aires. They do not take part in the behaviors of modern urban dwellers. They seem to be a remnant of some older time. And so this was taken by some critics as a hint to the class status. Perhaps this is the story of a pair of siblings who were upper class, higher class, and whose family has kind of fallen out of fashion over the years. and they are anxious about losing their house to these squatters who, at the time of Peronist governments, came out of nowhere sometimes into houses that were abandoned and would eventually not leave. So this is the reading for it being a political allegory. Cortázar was asked about it during his lifetime, and he did not confirm nor deny it. He simply encouraged readers to welcome multiple readings of the same story. This is basically what he said. When he was asked about the story being an allegory, he said, no, it's absolutely true. And this was perhaps the first time that I discovered what is deep down a very beautiful thing. And that is the possibility of having many readings for the same text. By this, I mean discovering that there are readers who follow your work, who are interested in what you do, and who are simultaneously reading your stories or novels from a different perspective to the one that I had when I was writing the story. So Cortázar did indeed write the story after he had a nightmare, and this is not the reading that he had in mind, but he has welcomed it. And I think indeed this reading perhaps was it was helped by the fact that Cortázar faced accusations during his lifetime of being an anti-Peronist. Perhaps this also made it very easy for people to assume that this was the meaning in the story. In interviews, just for what it's worth, Cortázar has said many times that he was not opposed to Peronism, that he just found the party to be a bit too ideological, quote unquote, and that he recognized that the party made big wins for working class people, such as himself and his mom. He was just not on board to support them openly in his classroom. And then this, it created some problems for him as an academic. For me, as a young Argentinian, it is interesting to see different takes on the same political period, because some people in Argentina are, of course, diehard Peronists, and they would argue that that party was the best thing that could have happened to Argentinian politics. But at the time, indeed, because it was such a big change, it was very controversial. And so it gave way to very different and opposing views and opinions. Cortázar visited Cuba a couple of times later on in his life. He died quite young, but I think he did come around during his lifetime. I think when he published Hopscotch, for example, and the novel did very well, he chose to use some of that money and donate it to the victims of the first military coup, the first one relating to Peronism. There were more in Argentina. But his views were at least not that easy to understand. I think perhaps because of that, he was forced to speak on them a few times during his lifetime. But indeed, he did visit Cuba a lot. He was in favor of the Cuban government at the time. It was just Peronism he didn't quite like. To me, the interesting thing with this reading is that it shows that the short story can accommodate more than one reading, and so that this speaks to its potential, on the one hand, as a literary work, because it can accommodate different metaphors, but also as a cultural artifact. It seems to be a story that brought to the forefront of culture a socio-political anxiety of the time and encouraged a discussion of it. So because of that, I would think the story did quite a good job as a starter of conversations, as most literature should be. That is everything for today, but you're welcome to share your thoughts now if you want. You can also leave. It's completely up to you. I would like to mention, though, that this class is a taster session for a course on contemporary Latin American literature. And it is an example of what we would be doing during the course, which is analyze a handful of literary works from very famous authors, as well as the context in which they came up, and a few things about the writer's style and the kind of the literary devices of choice of each writer. So it's a bit literary, it's also a bit cultural, contextual, historical, and if you're interested in signing up, please feel free to do so. We will be looking at other Argentinian authors, such as Borges and Mariana Enríquez, but we will also be looking at Allende, Garcia Marquez, and a lot of the authors you all mentioned today. So it's all the hits. The course will be run in this way, so even if you don't speak any Spanish at all, for example, when I try to mention the verb haber and whatnot. I will always try to accommodate English speakers. That is the idea of the course. If you have some knowledge of Spanish, I bet it can help you appreciate translations a little bit more, but we will still talk about them. And the reading material is always delivered both in Spanish and in English.
I've just pasted something in the chat, which is basically the details of the course. It's 6 weeks long over the summer on Monday evenings. And as Victoria said, the lessons are a bit longer than today. They're 1.5 hours long. But the format will be very similar, and we'll send out like pre-reading, a little bit of reading to do before each week, before each lesson. And there are also 2 optional written assessments, which would be like essays or commentaries or a translation. And then I've also listed the authors that we're going to cover and the payment methods. So you can either pay in one go or over 3 months in 3 installments.
Yeah, the idea of the course, it's focused on contemporary Latin American literature. And we will explore some of the most famous Latin American writers, but especially for those of you who are students and who are interested in perhaps studying languages or Spanish, we have a special focus on the writers that are discussed at Oxford and Cambridge. I am a tutor of undergraduate students, and this is indeed what pops up in their syllabus. So we will start with Alejo Carpentier, who may not be very well known, especially I think for European writers, but he is the writer who inaugurated the genre of magical realism. And his novel is also a very detailed and an excellent historical portrayal of the revolution in Haiti. So it also deals with issues of representation and identity. And these themes eventually become very popular in Latin American literature in general. So he's a bit of a pioneer. Then we jump to Garcia Marquez, who we consider to be more of a postmodern writer. So his writing is more experimental, and he likes to play around with our understandings of language, but also of history. He's very fond of creating fake histories to kind of test the limit between fact and fiction. And he always tries to bring to us a proposition about Latin American society. So he usually highlights injustices or unjust relationships between different people in Latin American society. So it also allows for a very good discussion on that. Then we will go to Juan Rulfo, who is a Mexican writer. He is very well known, and we will look into his short stories. And the stories are very interesting because they depict very well the conflict that rural workers were in Latin American countries. So the stories speak to how Latin American countries were, during the modern period, were kind of caught between an old regime that was emulating European colonialism and a new regime that requires economic, political, and social changes that are painful and slow. This also comes up in Isabel Allende, which is another writer we will study. We will study her most famous work, The House of Spirits, Casa de los Espíritus, which is a perfect example of a political allegory, I would say, which in a bit of a complicated way describes the rise of socialism and eventually of military coups in Chile. So it's a good opportunity to explore the context of the Chilean politics, as well as a great example of magical realism. In her story, a lot of supernatural elements are incorporated into daily lives, and it is fun as readers to speculate on what these supernatural elements could be alluding to. And then, who am I missing? We're also going to discuss Jorge Luis Borges, who is, I think he is a very famous writer. I've seen a lot of his books here in Waterstones and different bookstores in the UK. Borges was an Argentinian writer who was writing alongside Cortázar, and he is mostly well known for his very postmodern approach to literature. So in Borges, a story is not just a story. A story is a reference to another book. It's a reference to history. It's a reference to the process of writing itself. His work has a lot of philosophical meaning, and while it's not as connected to its context as other Latin American novels, which we could consider historical novels, his works are a very good representation of the philosophical debate that was taking place around literature and the critique of literature in the 20th century. And finally, we will close our course with Mariana Enríquez, who is a very, very contemporary writer. She just published a book, I think last year or the year before. She is Argentinian as well, and she writes short stories which try to depict in creative ways the challenges of living in a society. So some of her short stories talk to the conflict between men and women, for example. Others talk about the conflict between people from different social classes. And she has a style of writing that is very distinct. Stephen King is one of her main inspirations. So this is the only time in the course where we will really get into the horror genre, and we will explore stories that are perhaps a bit more shocking, but also fun, because we will get to talk about how a story becomes scary. So that's pretty much a summary of the course. If you're interested in joining, feel free. I'd love to have you. And like I said, the classes are longer, so ideally we will have more time for discussion.